On the 29th of April 2014, a prisoner named Clayton Lockett is scheduled to undergo the death penalty by lethal injection in Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Many would call it justice. The man condemned to die is responsible for some pretty nasty stuff, and in 1999, he took the life of 19-year-old Stephanie Neyman, who endured unspeakable suffering under Lockett before being shot twice in the chest with a shotgun and then buried alive to expire from her wounds. Deserved as it may be, though, Mr. Lockett isn't too pleased about the whole ordeal, and he spends the day refusing to cooperate with his executioners. Things get so out of hand that at one point the prison staff have to taser him into submission. Later that day, he'll even try to cut himself open in order to bleed out before his execution and avoid enduring the lethal injection. It will, however, all be for naught. By 6 p.m, he had been successfully strapped into a gurney, which effectively restrained him so that the procedure could begin. But unfortunately for everyone involved, this is not an orderly conclusion to an otherwise eventful day. Actually, it's just the beginning of an absolute horror story, as the procedure goes wrong in nearly every way imaginable. Lethal injection typically works by injecting 3 separate drugs intravenously into the victim while they're restrained in a gurney. The first drug, usually sodium thiopental or pentobarbital, induces a state of unconsciousness in the victim within about 30 seconds, and in the doses required for the lethal injection, it's so potent that it will eventually cause death by depressing respiratory activity. But in order to ensure death every single time, 2 more drugs are administered. The second is pancuronium or vecuronium bromide, which further suppresses breathing activity by paralyzing the diaphragm and other respiratory muscles. And then finally, the third drug, potassium chloride, is administered, which is the heart stopper. It causes an abnormal heartbeat and ultimately death by cardiac arrest. The first drug essentially knocks you out so you don't suffer, and the next 2 ensure that you die while you're unconscious. Well, that's how it works on paper. It's designed to be the most humane way to apply the death penalty, but in reality, it doesn't always go to plan, as in the case of Clayton Lockett. The first difficulty that staff faced during the procedure was that they were unable to insert an IV needle into any of Lockett's veins, trying first at the forearms, then at the biceps. When the paramedic was unable to successfully implant the IV, she asked for the help of a doctor named Johnny Zelmer to assist her. The mere fact that a qualified doctor who had sworn the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm was involved in the application of the death penalty remains an incredibly controversial detail. But with the help of the doctor, there were 3 more failed attempts to attach the IV. First, to the jugular vein in Lockett's neck. The next 2 attempts came to the left foot, then another failure at the subclavian vein next to the collarbone, and then finally, after 8 separate failed attempts, they were finally able to insert the IV into the femoral vein in Lockett's groin. Lockett's execution was scheduled to begin at 6 p.m. It was now 6:20 p.m, and they had only just managed to insert an IV. Although it's difficult to feel sorry for Clayton given his previous crimes, I think we can all agree that that's a long time to wait for the inevitable, and it's about to get worse. At this stage, the curtain is drawn so that the witnesses can see Clayton alone in the room, strapped to the gurney and with the IV in his groin. While all of this was happening, a spokesman for the Oklahoma Corrections Department named Jerry Massey explained to the witnesses that they were using a different combination of drugs for this execution, and that they were switching out the first drug, the sedative pentobarbital, for something else called midazolam. "Don't be surprised," he said, "if the new sedative takes a little longer to take effect. This decision will have consequences." Lockett was then asked if he had any final words, to which he responded, no. Then, at 6:23 p.m, the execution began with the injection of the new sedative, midazolam. By 6:30 p.m, 7 minutes after the drug was administered, Lockett's eyes were closed, with his mouth slightly open, but his executioners had already felt something wasn't quite right. The prison warden, Anita Trammell, stood over the man in the gurney before declaring, "Mr. Lockett is not unconscious. Another setback, and so the procedure was put on hold for 3 minutes to wait and see how the midazolam would affect Lockett. By 6:33 p.m, with his head resting towards the witnesses, he was declared unconscious, and the following 2 drugs were injected: vecuronium bromide to suppress breathing and potassium chloride to stop the heart. At 6:36 p.m, around 3 minutes after these were injected, Lockett began to shake violently on the gurney before raising his head and trying to speak in a quiet but terrified voice. His exact words are contested by the eyewitnesses, but they were either, "Oh man, I'm not," or "Something's wrong." At this site, the warden ordered that the blinds be closed, and this was the last thing that the witnesses were able to observe. The torment itself, however, would go on for much longer. At 6:37 p.m, Lockett struggled to raise himself from the gurney before collapsing back down with a loud exhale. A lawyer present at the execution would go on to remark that it looked like torture, and to an extent, it was. If you remember, Oklahoma State Penitentiary had switched out the first drug for sedation, and so midazolam was used instead of the usual pentobarbital. Midazolam is not an anesthetic, it's a sedative, and so although Lockett was drowsy and paralysed, he was not unconscious or anaesthetized. He was lucid for the entire procedure and would have been able to experience the usual level of pain that one would when unmedicated. Once the next drug entered his body, he would have slowly felt himself become paralysed as the vecuronium bromide inched up his blood vessels and spread from his groin to his chest, where it would take effect on the diaphragm, intercostal muscles, and anything else that you need to respire. He was, in real time and whilst fully conscious, feeling himself asphyxiating as his lungs gradually refused to draw in each desperately needed breath. It would have felt like being buried alive from the inside. And then the next drug came, potassium chloride, which is the heart stopper. Potassium chloride works by upsetting the delicate balance of potassium and sodium inside your heart, and when these fall out of whack, you're unable to maintain a regular heartbeat. So when that balance is disrupted by an enormous dose of potassium chloride, cardiac arrest is inevitable. This means that, again, while still alive and conscious, Lockett would have essentially experienced the agony of a heart attack, all whilst being unable to talk, groan, or even gasp for air, because let's remember, his lungs are paralysed. It gets worse though, because potassium chloride is extremely painful once in the body, as the high concentrations of potassium ions activate nerve receptors inside the veins of the patient, which scream pain signals to the brain. Some doctors have even described the sensation of potassium chloride in the bloodstream as being like liquid fire coursing through your veins. Inch by inch, section by section of agonizing burning until it finally reaches your heart and finishes the job. All of this, of course, sounds utterly terrifying, and it does still actually somehow manage to get worse for Lockett. But first, many of you may be wondering why they switched out the procedure and used midazolam instead of the usual pentobarbital. And here's where things get kind of interesting. See, when a lot of these pharmaceutical companies, especially those in the EU, found out that their drugs were being used for executions, they didn't like it. Most of them halted the supply of these products to the US until they were assured that they wouldn't be used for the application of the death penalty. Since the US healthcare system relies on lots of these drugs for routine procedures and the business of saving lives, assurances were made and the US justice system lost its supply of pentobarbital. In response, individual states started to secretly stockpile their own sources of sedatives and anesthetics to be used in the lethal injection. Things got so bad that at one point the Drug Enforcement Agency was raiding state pharmaceutical inventories to make sure they weren't breaking the rules on using drugs for the death penalty, such as in 2011 where the DEA confiscated the state of Georgia's supply of UK-manufactured sodium thiopental, a sedative, because it hadn't yet been approved by the FDA and it was scheduled for use on death row inmates. Midazolam entered the scene as a suitable and available alternative to these foreign anesthetics, but as you and I now understand, this was not an appropriate substitute, so much so that within 3 weeks of Lockett's execution, some states even banned the use of midazolam in the euthanizing of animals because it was considered so inhumane and painful. Now, it's important to remember that the death penalty is not euthanasia. Euthanasia is the ending of a patient's life in order to reduce suffering, and is only euthanasia when it's used in the patient's best interests. The death penalty, on the other hand, is a punitive act, which is not used because it's in the prisoner's interest, but because it's in the state's interest. As such, you can quite easily make the argument that it doesn't need to be humane to the same degree that euthanizing animals is. But it's worth bearing in mind that the whole point of the death penalty by lethal injection is that it's supposed to be humane and painless and dignified, and was brought in to replace the barbarity of frying someone alive on the electric chair or having their chest blasted open by firing squad. But so far, the lethal injection seems far worse than these other more barbaric forms of execution, and it's also unreliable. On average, 7% of executions by lethal injection are botched, compared to just 3% by hanging, 2% by the electric chair, and 0% by firing squad. One last detail that I'd like you to consider is that despite everything you've heard about Lockett's execution, it wouldn't actually qualify as botched by this stage because the use of midazolam was standard procedure. It was, however, grim as it is, about to get far worse. If we remember, Clayton Lockett received his first injection of midazolam at 6:23 p.m. By 6:36 p.m., 13 minutes after the sedative, Lockett then received the last 2 drugs, which stopped the heart and lung function. Death usually occurs within 7 minutes after the last 2 drugs are administered, which means that by 6:43 p.m, Lockett should have been pronounced dead. In reality, he wouldn't die until another 30 minutes had passed, and the whole time he was in even worse agony than I had previously described. You see, up until now, we've been operating under the assumption that the drugs were delivered intravenously by an IV needle inserted in the femoral vein at his groin. But unfortunately for Lockett, at some stage between the IV being secured and the injection of the drugs, there was a problem with the IV line in his groin, and nobody noticed it because it was hidden under a privacy cloth. This meant that instead of the drugs entering his bloodstream as intended, they simply sank into the tissue around the groin, or didn't enter his body at all. This is why it took him a full 13 minutes to show signs of unconsciousness, despite receiving a dosage that should have knocked him out within less than minutes. And then he was finally able to struggle against his restraints and talk to the staff to tell them that there was something wrong, despite having been just pronounced unconscious. The midazolam wasn't properly in his bloodstream. The staff then sat and waited as Lockett convulsed in his gurney, trying to speak out, half paralysed as his face twisted in agony. The lethal drugs were still killing him, but instead of being delivered directly to the heart and lungs via the bloodstream, they were simply pooling into the flesh around his groin and slowly inching their way up the body and towards the major organs. I mentioned earlier that potassium chloride is extremely painful when in the body, and I will leave you to imagine the excruciating pain this would have inflicted as it soaked into that very sensitive area of flesh in and around the groin. After nearly 20 minutes of watching this horrifying sight unfold, the staff finally began to ask questions about why Lockett wasn't dying and why he was showing signs of immense suffering. And so when one of the doctors investigated to see what had gone wrong, they discovered that IV, which was not properly connected, either because it had fallen out of the blood vessel or that Lockett's vein itself had collapsed. At this stage, Oklahoma Department of Corrections Director Robert Patton was informed by the doctor that the IV line had failed and that the drugs had either been absorbed into the tissue or leaked out completely. Patton then asked the doctor if Lockett had at least received enough of the drug to kill him, to which the doctor replied, no. And then the director was informed that they didn't have any drugs left over in order to finish the job. As a result, at 6:56 p.m, the execution was officially halted, about 20 minutes after Lockett had received his excruciating dose of lethal poison directly into his inner thigh. There was a brief discussion between prison officials on whether or not they should take Lockett to hospital in order to try and get him help, but before they could make a decision, the poison was able to leak into Lockett's system and he suffered a fatal heart attack and was pronounced dead at 7:06 p.m, a whopping 43 minutes after the procedure had began. As a result, they actually postponed another execution, which was scheduled to take place 2 hours later using the very same procedure. But they wanted to stop and make sure everything was fine and that they could figure out what the problem with the procedure was. The fault, however, was determined to be the IV line, which failed due to Lockett's collapsed vein, and no blame was given to the unique cocktail of drugs which had, at that stage, been untested. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that Clayton Lockett was reluctant to cooperate with his executioners on the big day, and what I didn't tell you is that the reason he behaved this way was because he was utterly terrified. Shortly before the execution, Lockett's stepmother, named LaDonna Hollins, was reported to have said, "I want to know what mixture of drugs are you going to use now? Is this instant? Is this going to cause horrible pain? I know he's scared." He said he's not scared of the dying as much as the drugs administered. It would turn out that Lockett was right to be afraid. His execution couldn't have been more painful. Despite the enormous public horror that the case of Lockett produced, it was far from the last case in which the lethal injection had gone wrong, and it certainly wasn't the first. In 2006, a man named Angel Diaz was subjected to the lethal injection in Florida. Like Clayton Lockett, there had been an error with the IV line, meaning that the drugs were simply dumped into his tissue rather than his bloodstream. A second dose was then administered, and after 35 minutes of suffering, he was pronounced dead. Again, in 2014, Dennis McGuire was subjected to lethal injection. His death took more than 25 minutes, and according to reports, he was seen gasping for air, choking and snorting for 10 to 13 minutes after the drugs had been administered. Now, I know what you're thinking, that all of these are either outlier cases that were botched, or they're cases that include the use of midazolam, rather than the much more effective and typical pentobarbital or sodium thiopental. Well, as fortune would have it, in 2005, a group of University of Miami researchers and a death row attorney published a letter in The Lancet. In the article, they investigated toxicology reports from Arizona, Georgia, North and South Carolina, and found that post-mortem concentrations of sedatives in the blood were lower than that required for surgery in 88% of executed inmates, and that nearly half of all inmates had concentrations consistent with awareness, meaning that they would have felt every ounce of suffering possible as the chemical cocktail burns its way to the heart, paralysing the body along the way. Now remember, this study was measuring the good drugs, thiopental and pentobarbital, which actually induce a state of unconsciousness in the victim. But in recent years, midazolam, the same drug used on Clayton Lockett, has become the go-to substance, which, to say again, is not an anesthetic, but a sedative. As of today, there are still 7 states in the US which practice the death penalty with the use of midazolam as standard procedure. As for the lethal injection itself, there are 28 states in the US where it's practiced, but it's also used in China, Vietnam, Thailand, Nigeria, Guatemala, and the Maldives. Anyway, that's the lethal injection, designed to be a humane alternative to more crude methods of execution, but in reality, so much worse than you think.